yet another year, we are to the end of Booktube Prize. I'm about to submit my rankings, and you'll be seeing this once everything's wrapped up. Ranking was very, very hard this year. I think, as with last year, my semifinal round was actually stronger for me, but the final round was no complaints. This was fantastic. As a pure reading experience, all of these books were either 4 or 5 star reads for me, which is very high. There were a couple that had problems outside of the reading experience, so that did play into my ranking, but these were all great books. So any critiques I have, take with a bit of a grain of salt, because I really had to get down to nitpicking tiny details and being very critical in order to do this ranking in the first place. And be judgmental, because it's my job to judge these. So let us dive into my bottom 2, and the bottom 2 I had issues outside of the reading experience, in that my bottom choice I actually liked better than my 5th place choice as a book, but it had some pretty significant issues from the citation standpoint. So for my bottom choice, you probably already know if you watched the whole vlog, but it's His Name is George Floyd. This is a biography with history woven through that takes a look at the life and eventual murder of George Floyd at the hands of police in 2020 Minnesota. And I do think that the information is all correct, and the quality of the information is not something I question, but the availability of information in terms of the citations I found very significantly at issue. So we had whole citations that do not reference a specific person. They just say we talked to family. Things that were just not clear. Things that needed citation. And because this is a biography, or I should say, this is a biography, but it feels more like a memoir, because the accounts of his life are taken from personal anecdotes of people who knew him. So they have done immense amounts of interviews. And again, I don't doubt those interviews happened, but it's very difficult to trace back who specifically was interviewed. And so that's really the one knock that I have on this. In terms of actually weaving the story of his life and including the history, the systemic oppressions that affected the man he became, and how that's told to us, it's so powerful. I feel like this is a book that the authors actually did the work to tell a really powerful story and build the narrative. And so I can see the strength of the authorial work here, more so than in books later on. So this was number 6 in my rankings. In 5th place, I have The Escape Artist by Jonathan Friedland. This is again a singular individual biography surrounding Rudolf Verba, who escaped from Auschwitz. And so this is focused very much in early 1940s, and specifically, probably 70% of this book is focused on the year 1944. And we are following as we see what has happened in Slovakia leading up to internment camps, and then eventually deportment and his transfer to Auschwitz. And so him building his life there, or what allows him to survive there, him planning and collecting information for how he might escape and what he might do with information once he gets out to help get across the plight of what's happening, because he cannot fathom that anyone outside would know what's going on. And truly, most places, people do not. But it is a horrifying story about him, in fact, escaping. That's not a spoiler, obviously it's in the title, but he does escape. He does get out. He does share information. And it is not really taken well. It's not really handled in a way that makes immediate impacts. And even people who don't doubt the claims are just utterly ineffective at making quick change of things that are occurring. And so this is enabled to continue on. And it's just horrifying to read. So the weight and heft of the story are in the subject matter. So I don't feel like the author really brought anything to that in the first place. And the places in this where the authorial voice do show through, usually at the end of chapters, and in fact much more strongly toward the end of the book, I really didn't like it. Because the author is kind of a thriller writer, he tends to dramatize things, and this is not a story that needs more drama, really. So I just felt that was not the right way to go, perhaps, for my liking. And I also think that as a thriller writer, he had a skill that does enable some improvement to this book, in that it's very brief, it's very quick moving, it's really easy to read. So again, this is a very good book. I think he imparted the information in a really readable way. But my major drawback is that, again, I have a sort of reference and citation issue, in that I did go on to read part of, or the Kindle sample, to Rudolf Verba's own memoir. And it has much of the same information, which I fully expected, but very direct information that is imparted in this book. And a couple of times that I was already able to find in the sample are not directly cited. Unlike the previous book, I do feel like every person he talked to get information and every source is available here. So I think you certainly could track back the information. I'm just not sure it's totally clearly cited. So unfortunately for these two bottom picks, I have sort of more issues with the formatting and referencing as nonfiction works, more so than the book. I also really do think that in this case, where we have a primary sourced work from the individual that this happened to, like if it were a memoir that were written by someone who were not a writer and they did a bad job of it, you would probably want an author to come through and address that and tell the story again in a more deft way. And I don't feel like that's been done here. I feel like, from what I read of Verba's own memoir, the authorial voice is better. The heart of the story is better. It's much more lively than this work. And so my feeling is to say I'm happy that this is drawing attention to the life of this individual. Given that there is a primary source work available, I would just say go directly to the source and read Verba's own memoir in this case, personally. Next, for my third and fourth place works, we again have kind of a reason why they're a little lower that's shared, and that reason is they both felt very repetitive to me. So in fourth place, I have Eating to Extinction. This was also one of the rare hopeful works, despite the topic. So the topic is how humans are really destroying biodiversity in our plant and food sources. And I think it was really well formatted in that we get sort of sections of different types of foods: meat, dairy, plant matter like forageable plants versus agriculturally derived plants. And the history of those things, we are looking at specific plants in each part. So we go through a litany of individual plants and how humans have affected them. And then the hopeful aspect is what someone or people are doing to preserve that type of plant or help bring back cultural practices that are being lost. And so I think that aspect was very hopeful, and it was great and really informative. I think in my previous video from the last round where I read this book, I did talk about how this feels like a sort of travel show, a food travel show, where you are traveling through all different parts of remote locations in the world and these different cultural practices that you're seeing, who these people are that are really invested in preserving these ancient foods that have sort of lost favor. And it's really harrowing to also hear about how much humans have just not cared about the importance of these foods, how we've not done research to find out what the benefits might be of these foods that are dying away, purely because we care about more things like nutrient density and how much we can proliferate these things kind of virally a bit. And so our priorities maybe aren't right, but we aren't doing the work to find out what might benefit us more or why. So this one was great, but it was very repetitive because each of those sections were going through plant after plant after plant and repeating kind of the same cycle over and over. So I think this would be easily one you could dip in and out of and really enjoy. Reading it all in one go was a little bit like deja vu. In third place, we have My Fourth Time We Drowned. And this is such a great, powerful book, but it's quite repetitive. And I think that is with authorial intent, because we are getting such a wide range of voices telling us the story of attempting to seek refuge by way of Libya to exit to Europe. And those experiences of trying to escape that country are harrowing on their own. But even more so, this is focused not on that experience as much as the experience of being knocked back and winding up stuck in Libya in internment camps. And these are horrific experiences that we're hearing over and over and over and over. And that repetition is effective in getting across that all of these voices in different areas, different cities, in the same camp or another camp entirely, are all telling the same horrific story. Everyone is experiencing the same awful things, and just the mass of that does come across through what the author is telling us. However, I think once we got past that huge amount of repetition, I was much more engaged once we started getting into the author telling us more about political fallout and criminal fallout for people involved, and more of her investigation that was separate from discussing directly with the refugees, I think was more effective for me. So I do wish there had been perhaps some editing down of that repetition, but that's a very minor critique. I think this was wonderful at getting across empathy for the refugee plight. I do feel, for my liking, I wish there had been either some hope or something actionable to this story, because I feel like we got more negative about how little things are working and nothing about what we can do to make this situation better. So I came out with a lot of empathy, which I already had, and didn't really add much to what I already knew or how I already felt about the situation. So I think that's me being incredibly harsh on this book. This is a really fabulous book in terms of journalistic integrity. I think it's there. I think the information is presented really well, other than the repetition aspect. I think some of those pages certainly could have been used to impart other things that were lacking. Down to my top two. The top two really could have gone either way, but yeah, it has to be in second place, An Immense World by Ed Yong. It just didn't quite make it right at this moment, but this is such a good book. This is a really great example of popular science. At every turn, this is accessible. This is all about communicating to us how limited human perception is and the variety of ways that animals can perceive the world differently from us. And it really does grapple with and struggle to get across to us how other creatures perceive the world, their sphere of perception. And it's fun to watch Ed Yong struggle to do that because he is trying to not draw from what we see or hear or human perception methods in telling us this, but he also is very limited to what is observable, what we can scientifically research and test for. And so there are a lot of things where he is trying to communicate this and get it across, and you can tell that the words just aren't quite there to express what an animal might experience, but he's doing his best to do so. And I just love that. That is another sense of empathy being such a strong aspect of this book, much like the previous one, that I think fits perfectly here near the top. From a format perspective, this really has exactly what you're looking for in a pop science work that's very accessible. It's really easy to read because you have short chapters that are organized by a perception type rather than like trying to cluster together similar animals. We get a range of animals that all have the same similar perception abilities. And I really liked that. I love the way that he built on those as he went along in a different perception topic. I love that there are multiple sections of pictures. There are two really good large sections of pictures, lovely glossy full color photos. And so that makes it more dynamic, certainly. And I also really love the most in this that Ed Yong specifically pulls in the experts. So throughout every single chapter, he is drawing from either historical or his own experiences in conversation really passionately with people who are experts, who mostly discovered something new or are researching something new and the cool thing that they discovered. And so that sense of passion absolutely comes through in this. So I felt compelled to read this. It's exactly what you want from a great, perfect example of pop science that is totally accessible to the lay reader. This is such a wonderful work about nature, and it sparks empathy and excitement in the reader, I think. So this is impeccable. I absolutely could hand this to anyone, and I have already checked out the audiobook to try and reread it while I have some people visiting, because it's just so great, and I would put it heartily in front of just about anybody. And so the first place winner for me is Paradise Falls. No real surprise that it is up here, but it's a surprise that this was sort of a sleeper hit. It is one that was completely under my radar for sure. I was not aware of it before the Booktube Prize, and it seems like many people experienced that as well and were totally surprised by it when they did read it for the prize, and it obviously has done quite well to make it in the final. And this is such a well-formatted, well-communicated book. It reads like corporate true crime, and that is what it is, but it's got a human story to it. It very much looks at this corporate true crime situation of toxic waste dumping that later was built over with just suburban neighborhoods and the fallout of that. But it takes the perspective of the people who live there. It really focuses on the lives and families of people impacted rather than getting into the corporate aspect. It does tackle that at some level, but it always centers the individuals, and I think that is so important to why this is such a great book. This also is a great example of information. For the earlier books where I was thinking about how clear and how transparent are these authors being about the information that they're relaying, the two examples that I was thinking of to contrast with were The Facemaker, which I read in the previous example, and there Lindsay Fitzharris, the author, specifically calls out the fact that she has an abnormal amount of personal conversational quotes, and specifically references, here's why and how I have that information. And in this case, in Paradise Falls, we also had something like that, where throughout the first part of the book, I was reading along and thinking, okay, there are some really specific pieces of information throughout this book, and odd things for someone to have, really personal information, personal details, dates, that sort of thing. And it was just strange that you would have access to, or that those things would even be recorded, right? This is quite historical. It's taking place over several decades. But in this case, as part of the book, Keith O'Brien does lay out eventually how exactly he has all that information and in detail. And so I loved that aspect because it is fully transparent. I do feel like the veracity of the information is not in doubt, and the clarity of where all of this information came from is really hyper present in the book. So I felt like that was fantastic. I also think it's great that not just the individual perspective, but women specifically are really centered in this story. He is critical of sort of the establishment looking down on the women involved here. Not just housewives, but women who are specialists in their field become involved in this and often are the only people who take the situation seriously or will listen to the housewives who are trying to advocate for themselves and their families. And I just loved that aspect to this. I think it's really important that those stories are told and highlighted where they may have been swept under the rug before. And I think what happened to these people, to these families living just their day-to-day lives and trying to be heard for the issues that they were having, really horrific issues. I mean, there certainly are illnesses and death as a result of this corporate malfeasance. These horrible stories deserve to be heard, and we should be learning from this. So as a result, we also see the hopeful future where the EPA is just starting up at the time that this case was going on. And so we see the EPA becoming involved and what politics can do about a situation like this. When we are in a modern setting where we feel like we may have come so far, we can look at that and see, okay, here are the positives to politics when we are in quite a negative political space in our world right now. That gives me some hope. And so I feel like this has both critical and hopeful elements to the storytelling that the author really did a great job of getting across. So I feel like this is like firing on all engines. This hits at every level. I feel like it's great from a storytelling aspect. It's great from a personal and heart aspect. It's great from a fact-based aspect. I have no doubts about the research done here, and it just tells an important story. So there you have it. Paradise Falls is my winner, but we have yet to see what the final winner of the prize is. So I hope everyone had a wonderful time following along with my Booktube Prize reading, and that is a wrap for yet another year. Thank you all so very much for watching.